Now talking about the digital transformation of transport and how do we actually need, and we tackled some of the topics already when we talk about digitalization, but we need to discuss it further. How do we need to shape digitalization for getting transport on a pathway that is really sustainable? So now I'd like to welcome the chairwoman of Deutsche Bahn, DB Cargo, and former head of Berlin Public Transport Company. She sent us a pre-recorded keynote, and the floor is now all hers. Sigird Nikutta is with us.
Mrs. Gönner, officials from transport ministries, environment ministries, national and local government agencies in Latin America, Africa, Europe and Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at the 2020 Transport and Climate Change Week. I don't need to convince this audience that transport is a key factor to solving the climate crisis. But, however, I would like to show you that it's one of the fastest and most cost-effective solutions we have at hand. And I would like to show you that there is more to look at than we are currently doing. Climate change is the biggest challenge of our century. We are the first generation to experience it. And we are perhaps the last generation who can do anything about it. We are facing a historic window of opportunity to do something. A couple of weeks ago, Germany's Constitutional Court ruled that our country's 2019 Climate Protection Act is in part unconstitutional. It said the law does not go far enough to sufficiently reduce greenhouse gas emissions and slow down climate change. The law does not slow down climate change fast enough and therefore violates the fundamental right to a good future for next generations. The present law places the consequences and burdens of our way of life on our children. And that is why, by the end of next year, the German government needs to draw up clearer reduction targets for greenhouse gas emissions for the period after 2030. Germany will be the country with the most ambitious goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The transport sector can make a real difference to achieve them. These targets are already being addressed by industry. I would like to give you some examples of customers who we speak to on a daily basis. Coke, for example, has announced that it will reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2025. Volkswagen, as another example, Germany's biggest car maker, wants to decrease their carbon footprint to zero until 2050. And the entire fleet of Mercedes-Benz is supposed to have zero emissions by 2030. And that, of course, not only includes the cars, but also components, supplies, and, of course, the transport from where they are manufactured to where they are needed. The court's ruling has given us a unique momentum to capitalize on if we use all the potential we have. And I can tell you, there is plenty of potential we can use. It's called rail freight. Rail freight. I have been working in the transport business for over 20 years. Before joining Deutsche Bahn, I worked as the chairwoman of BVG, the main public transport company in Berlin and one of the biggest of its kind in Europe. When we think about making transport greener, we mostly think about riding a bike on our daily commute instead of taking the car. We think about taking a train when we go on a business trip instead of booking a short distance flight. And we also think about how we can transform city centers to make them compact and smart, how we can enhance digitalization and how it can serve the common good. And we think about where to build bicycle paths and how to stock our fleets with electric buses. By the way, Berlin is a city with the highest amount of electric buses in Europe. Digitalization and electronic solutions in passenger transport immediately come to people's mind when we speak about green transport. And they are very important. Passenger transport is responsible for approximately 60% of greenhouse gas emissions today. But passenger transport is only half of the story. So what about the other 40%? Almost half of CO2 emissions are caused by the transport of goods. Everything we need for our daily lives. Food, furniture, online shopping, and we have seen the rise especially in times of the pandemic. But also wood for construction and chemicals to supply our pharmaceutical companies. When we speak about green transport, rail freight usually does not come in mind. But believe me, it should. I will give you the figures. In Germany, we generate a total of 800 million tons of CO2 emissions. The transport sector alone generates a quarter of them, 164 million tons. In the past 20 years, transport emissions have been the only ones which did not decrease compared to emissions from housing, energy or construction industry. But in order to meet our current target for 2030, and perhaps we will have more ambitious targets very soon, we have to reduce transport emissions by more than 40%, from 164 million tons of CO2 today to 95 million tons of CO2 in 2030. It will be a milestone to climate neutrality in 2050. The good news is we do have an immediate solution for that. The company I work for as a chairwoman, DB Cargo, is Europe's biggest rail freight operator. Deutsche Bahn alone has a network of more than 35,000 kilometers of rail infrastructure. DB Cargo operates in 18 countries with more than 30,000 employees. CO2 does not stop on borders, and our trains do not either. Freight transport is an international business, and more than 60% of freight trains cross at least one border. That is why I like the global approach to this year's Transport and Climate Change Week so much. Transport is per definition international, so we have to address both its challenges and its potential together. So, why is rail freight the game changer? Trucks emit 40 million tons of CO2 in Germany every year. Rail transport only emits 0.8 million tons of CO2 and transports 18% of goods. It has never been so easy, so fast to save CO2 on such a large scale. The only thing we need to do is to shift the transport of goods from road to rail. It is a fundamental component of cutting CO2 emissions in the transport sector. And it's fundamental to cut emissions in Germany and around the world. However, decision makers need the courage to implement political incentives to foster this trend. Those incentives need to balance efficiency, quality, and sustainability in the choices we make. Consumers also need to understand that transport matters for a sustainable lifestyle. Buying a t-shirt made from organic cotton is not enough. It is pointless if your shirt has been transported by a truck all over Europe. My goal, and the goal of all my colleagues who work in the rail freight business, is to raise awareness that freight transport is an important part of the solution. But how do we get there? How do we get beyond moralizing, beyond instructing, and beyond regulating, and even sometimes threatening people to change their behavior? The market economy can provide us with an answer. Ronald Coase was a British economist and Nobel Prize laureate. He had the idea to install a carbon emission trading system. This system is so powerful and so efficient because it reaches the big corporate emitters where it hurt them the most, in their pockets. As a psychologist, I know the difference between individual and collective rationality. For an individual, there is no real incentive to, for example, waive the airplane ticket because the individual contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is relatively small. The transformation we need will only work if we install the right incentives so that companies have no other economic choice than to go green. The market has to tell them green is smart. And rail freight is an essential part of that smart solution. And therefore, rail freight is also an essential part of a green future. Thank you to the International Climate Initiative of the Federal German Ministry for the Environment and to the GIZ team for organizing this important global event. I wish all of you an inspiring week.
Sigird, Nikutta, thank you very much for joining and for participating in the Transport and Climate Change Week 2021, and of course for sharing your priorities with us.